Hello, everybody. Welcome to another ASFP Sparking Interest podcast. I think this is our fourth of the year so far. So you'll be watching this at some point in the year after we've done the wonderful editing work that we normally do. So today we were talking in our last interview, which was with Andrea White from Women Talking Fire, that these days we tend to get some relatively notable individuals come and talk to us. They're clamouring to come and sit on the ASFP sofa and tell the world about of their view of it and what they're currently doing in support of us and our members and the wider fire industry. So there's no exception today. Today we have Aman Sharma. So for those of you who are not familiar with said notable individual, I'm going to read out his little bio. Well, it's actually not little. I'm probably doing it a disservice. So Aman is CEO and co-founder of Totus Digital, a former officer of the Fire and Rescue Service. He's an experienced fire engineer and has worked across some of Europe's largest infrastructure programs. He's the former deputy chair of the Building Regulations Advisory Committee, or BRAC, for those of you who like your acronyms, and now a member of the inaugural Building Advisory Committee, or BAC, supporting the building safety regulator. He chairs a number of cross-industry working groups for fire safety and building regulations and co-convened the BAC Golden Thread Working Group, the government's primary source of support for the development of the Golden Thread. Aman is chair of BSI technical committees FSB 111 and FSH 1411, an experienced non-executive director. He continues to work closely with central and local government, local authorities, enforcing authorities, trade bodies, check, and housing providers. Aman, welcome to the ASFP.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure to have you here. Welcome to the comms room. In terms of where we are today, we're about a year on from when we last probably sat down and had a coffee together, and things have clearly developed. For us, one of the inspiring things was that quite a lot of the companies that provide software packages in support of the Golden Thread, or installation information, have joined the ASFP to the point that we now have actually formed a new technical group, TG9. And is creating with that group a best practice guidance document on how those systems should collate, store, and regurgitate post-installation, post-occupation information, because not taking anything away from how they individually operate and the added value that their systems add in terms of their commercial offerings, because of course they're all competing with each other, so they're all looking to add additional added value. We felt that it was also sensible to say that there should be a minimum set of requirements around how those systems work, and that was sort of probably inspired partly by your presentation at the AGM, of which some of those organisations attended, and partly because, of course, things have moved on and there's a greater demand. And I will just quote, and hopefully this will help inspire us. So I'll just read something very quickly. So this is the ASFP's pass mark criteria. So the pass mark is for ASFP members to achieve a certain criteria outside of the requirements of normal ASFP membership, which historically was you had to be a third-party certified company. Third-party certification is great. However, over the last few years, we've realised it's not a panacea, and therefore there has to be more. So I'll just very quickly read. So for passive fire protection installers, for an ASFP member to achieve the pass mark, they have to achieve the following. And I'll very quickly point out that at the moment, there is still work to do to enable people to achieve the pass, organisations to achieve the pass mark. However, this is the 6 bullet points. So meet the requirements of an ASFP member category C1. So that's contractors, especially subbies. Be certified by one of the third-party certification schemes adopting the ASFP minimum requirements, because the cert bodies have agreed to wrap a set of minimum requirements additional to what is already included in those schemes for ASFP members. Must operate a digital data communication installation information record keeping system that follows the principles of the ASFP Gold Book, it's TG9, in terms of level of installation details and content stored. Register all staff, including employees directly or indirectly contracted labour, including via CIS, on the ASFP competency register, providing evidence of competence in activities undertaken as defined in the ASFP competency framework. Ensure that any work in this area that is subcontracted is undertaken by a company that also meets the criteria of the pass mark. Must install products that are supported by third-party certification where applicable, and recommend products supplied by manufacturers that have achieved the pass mark. Companies undertaking high-risk installation activities, including the installation of external cladding, must also ensure adequate professional indemnity insurance cover is in place for all installation works undertaken whilst holding the pass mark. So that is some way beyond just being a third-party certified company. But the one I want to sort of labour on is the fact that they must operate a system that records their installation. So on that basis, we're opening up a whole level of engagement with them, because they'll have more questions on how they achieve the pass mark. The pass mark, incidentally, is what we're going to drive into industry, drive into government, drive anywhere we can get it, where basically products or provisions of service installation should be done under somebody holding the pass mark, because in effect that supports, certainly from a procurement point of view in terms of the principal contractors, it covers a whole lot of the remit of what they would be looking for under a pre-qualification questionnaire in terms of employing that particular installer. And it's been welcomed by that community. It's been welcomed by the cert bodies to be able to create a more robust certification scheme. And the digital data organisations have welcomed it, because, of course, what it means is that we're getting commonality in terms of how data is stored once things have been installed. From your position, and of course it's an area that you are, working very closely in, from a point of view of an ASFP contractor member, where do you think the things are in terms of that, and how best do you think that the work that you've been doing can support that ability to be able to store that data and then be used later on?
Well, firstly, it's really encouraging to hear that if we go back to what Dame Judith's original vision was for not just the Golden Thread, but her vision of asking industry to own and draft the guidance and the standards that it should work to. I think what I'm hearing in TG9 is a manifestation of Dame Judith's vision in that for the Golden Thread, which is really encouraging to hear. I would dispute whether or not I inspired that specifically, but no, it's good to hear that at least in this specific part of the industry, that there is that piece of work happening that will need to undoubtedly come together with other programs of work to make sure that there is that commonality across the board. To the specific point, I think where we are now, since we last spoke about this in the context of the policy at last year's AGM, of course, is that your groups, your members, will have seen sight now of the secondary legislation. So in particular, the keeping and provision regulations and what's known as the higher risk building procedures and Schedule 1. Now, there are schedules in both of those regulations which set out exactly the detail that people were asking, if you recall, this time last year, that sets out in detail what the expectations are from a regulatory perspective for this thing we call the Golden Thread. And if I stay there for a second and then build down and come to the specific part of your question, some of the learning that we're hoping to cascade further, both within central government, but also through relevant industry bodies as well, is the distinct nuances between what we refer to as Part 3 requirements and Part 4 requirements of the Golden Thread. And again, that's something that we've been quite consistent with in the messaging. And of course, I'm referring to Part 3 of the Building Safety Act itself and Part 4 of the Act. Because it is still a matter of some confusion, if you can believe that. Even though this information is public and people are, I'm sympathetic to the fact that there is still some confusion in this area because there's a lot of information out there. And if we recognize, and if you'll indulge my clarification for this part of the
ASAP
conversation,
podcasts are all about indulgence, so just
well,
indulge yourself.
I'll indulge away. Part 3, when we talk about the golden thread as it relates to part 3 of the Building Safety Act, we very much are talking amongst the totality of Schedule 1 of the building regulations as amended. So that is everything from Part A all the way through to Part S and eventually Part T, because we are going to have a Part T in the offing in the very near future. But your body of evidence that you are pulling together to demonstrate compliance to Schedule 1, that is the benchmark. It's the building regulations, which is the primary focus, with a drill down into Parts B, F, L, and O, because Part B being what it is, and F, L, and O being what I would describe as very important secondary elements that inform fire safety and the demonstration of compliance to fire safety. Now, as we move into Part 4, it becomes far more nuanced. It becomes a whole and sole focus on Parts A and B, so structural safety and fire safety specifically. But if we come into the context of, and I'm sure we'll come on to safety cases and safety case reports in particular, any supporting information that the principal accountable person deems appropriate to then present as part of that body of evidence that is primarily based on Parts A and B. So your golden thread is quite a different golden thread as it relates to Parts 3 and Parts 4, albeit throughout the technical life cycle of a building in the future, and we're hoping for this standard to be the standard as we go through, as you sit down to brief, plan, design, construct, hand over, and operate your building, your Part 3 evidence base should be informing your Part 4 ongoing maintenance. So it's an important clarification to make here that what the building safety regulator won't be regulating against in the operational phase of a higher risk building is the duty holder's ability to update, maintain, and meet all those golden thread principles for all of the information you captured at Part 3 during the occupational phase, where it's Part 4.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very important clarification to make, because then if we come to the buzzword that's inherent within all of those regulations at the moment, and I think a lot of people were expecting the word digital to be prevalent across those regulations, and of course that word is not used once. It is electronic. And the reason for that is because there's previous legal precedents for the use of the word electronic specifically, and there is a lot of, if I can use the word very carefully, ambivalence around, what is digital, what is data, and how do you actually regulate for a digital provision specifically. The element I think that is important in terms of what TG9's focus might be there is how does software more generally across the industry come together to support that specific and nuanced regulatory provision, whether it relates to Part 3 or Part 4, because the challenge here is we have in-flight new stock going through its various phases as we speak. We have hopefully a healthy pipeline of new higher risk buildings that are in the offing and will soon be part of our existing built environment. And of course, we've got some 14,000 plus existing HRBs that are, I'm sure APs and PAPs are currently beavering away to develop safety cases and safety case reports for.
Yes. So
where does the digital provision touch into all of that? Well, I've always, and I've said previously, and I will say, continuously, that digital solutions are not the silver bullet to this thing called the golden thread. They are an absolutely important part of it, because it has to be electronic. We cannot do this paper-based thing that we were doing previously.
No.
But I'm really encouraged to see that a significant part of the software vendor market is starting to recognize that a wholly compliant golden thread solution is probably not a 2024, even a 2025 conversation that we can have yet.
Yeah.
It's far too complicated a system to pull together. That being said, I like to refer to certain software provisions as being able to come together as part of a digital ecosystem. So you see this more so on major infrastructure projects in high hazard sectors in particular, where you might have, for example, 3 or 4 different software solutions that might be coming together to do very specific functional things on that project. That is a demonstration of your body of evidence that complies to the golden thread. And a good example is EDMS. So, we all know the obvious electronic document management systems, but that's what they do. They manage documents electronically. Are they all things to all people for golden thread? No, they're not. They have a very specific function, and they perform that function very, very well. If a duty holder decides that as part of their golden thread, as part of the information they want to present to the regulator during those relevant phases of a construction project, that they would like to capture information relevant to passive fire protection, which I highly advise is an appropriate thing to do, of course.
Of course, yeah.
An EDMS would probably not be appropriate for that. You'd be looking at something that's capturing information and evidence photographically and so on and so forth, and that is feeding into that quantum of evidence that you are then going to put forward to the regulator to demonstrate exactly why you have met those relevant functional requirements of the building regulations. So the consistency and that standardization exercise within this group coming together, I hope very much will be able to flush out those thematic commonalities that, irrespective of their particular solution, they are meeting consistent principles, and perhaps even the baseline of those principles are those 10 principles that BRAC published some years ago now, that went on to inform the secondary regulations that we have and are referred to in the secondary regulations. But that crosses over into the digital conversation quite nicely. So it'd be very, very interesting to see how that evolves.
Yeah, and I think that document, or the 10 points you mentioned, I think that is part of the memory when I looked at the initial bundle of things to consider or discuss or take into account for how the gold book, and there's a reason behind the name, eventually will form, because I think it's interesting, because when we were talking to the third party certification providers about the schemes they run for certifying passive fire installation, it's always hard to get competing organisations to create something that's common across all of them, because they all basically try and sell a product that has defined differences, which they would call sort of added value, which is why you should use theirs over and above somebody else's. And in some respects, that creates a bit of a pressure point, because then of course it mitigates the ability to be able to create commonality. And commonality is what end users of the information of those systems or the schemes need, because then you've got a datum that you can measure against, to say whether that's right or not. So it's quite a hard thing to do.
It's a matter of great irony, isn't it? That the commercialization of what we're describing here is the main blocker to that innovation. And
it is in a way.
The behaviours that we saw as recently as 2 or 3 years ago from some software vendors in the market were undesirable. Is the best way to put it. There was a lot of misinformation coming through from a minority across the industry that didn't go unnoticed. I'll leave that there. But that's the risk, that's the risk that we have when we are in what I call the midst of the largest generational reform to building safety that we're going through. And we are rightfully going through that because we owe that to the lives that we've lost both in June 2017 and previously in other high profile fires. But where we should be absolutely clear is the end users are not the the buyers of these software solutions. The end users are the residents
Yes.
of those people that will be dwelling in higher risk buildings and be in the vicinity of them. Ultimately, if we go right back to Dame Judith's 2018 interim report and her final report in 2019, she reminds us, and it's very telling that in March 2024, a lot of that still rings true and is very, very accurate today in terms of her capturing of the industry as it was back then, and her 50 plus recommendations that needed to be taken forward into legislation. It is all still wholly relevant, and I think central to her message was the fact that we are at risk of letting that same group down, the residents, those real end users of these solutions, whether they're primary or very tangential end users, because ultimately it's them that have the most to lose. So at a superficial level, if a buyer of a particular software solution that might be rubber stamped as your golden thread, golden bullet, as opposed to a silver bullet, will soon come to realize that perhaps they've been missold something when they're face to face with the regulator, presenting said solution as a means of compliance. But I very much hope that that won't happen. And again, the mood music and the behaviours have started to significantly shift. I've noticed in a personal capacity with a number of vendors now that the regulations are clear about what those roles and responsibilities are actually for. Yeah.
No, I think you're right. I mean, in terms of the last 12 months in your world, what do you think the most significant development, either from where it was to where it is now, has been, or what do you think the most significant thing coming in or that's happened from a year ago when we last met? It wasn't there and now it's somewhere. I mean, what do you think the two sort of biggest step changes are?
I think at a sort of higher industry level, certainly the regulator coming into force and acting as the building control body for higher risk buildings from October last year, incepted some very meaningful conversations about what actually good looks like for going through Gateways 2 and Gateways 3 respectively. And still today, comparatively, only a handful of projects really have sort of, stepped into the fray, either voluntarily by stepping and don't forget as well, there were I'm unclear on how many chose to opt into the regime, because the option was there. If you were a principal accountable person, if you were a duty holder, I should say, during designing construction, you could choose to cross over from your current building control body and voluntarily go into the
so you could transition, even though it was some way down.
I'm unclear on how many actually chose to do that, and I can probably suspect why. But in terms of the original question, I would suggest yes, the most significant action and most significant event has been that new requirement from October last year, and the closing out of that transitional period where those schemes that haven't made a meaningful start on their sites will by proxy cross over into this new regime, and the subsequent discussions that have come out of that requirement, including exactly what level of information do I, as a developer, as a duty holder during Part 3, need to provide to the regulator at Gateway 2. And I find those conversations very, very interesting for two reasons. The first of which, to my knowledge, and I'm sure yours as well, the concept and idea of developing an evidence base to the building regulations is not a novel one.
No.
So this is something we should have been doing.
It's just
quite consistent.
It's more to do with the method. It's more to do with the method of how it's actually
the manner in which it is prepared. The personnel. Where this is where we come into the competency discussion that are contributing to that information development and therefore management. But equally, and this is more opportunity than I see as, or what most may see as risk. But what opportunities fall out from these new requirements for duty holders to think differently about their program structure? So contract designer portions are a very, very well known and accepted mechanism during design. But candidly, if we overlaid that against a plan of work today, I think most CDPs would fall past Gateway 2. And that's me being highly generic, amongst most of the POAPs that we've probably seen in the last few years. But that triggers that very relevant question on, well, what is suitable and what is sufficient in terms of the information that is being presented via what's defined as the prescribed documents. So these are the documents that people have become very familiar with now at Gateway 2 and Gateway 3, I hope, and your construction control plans, your fire and emergency files, etc., etc. Exactly what level of information needs to go into that will give the regulator satisfaction that the relevant requirements have been met. Now, you'll be unsurprised to hear me say that the regulator is not going to answer that question for the industry, and nor should it, because I think if the regulator or representatives from the regulator were joining us on this lovely red sofa, they would remind us that their benchmark criteria are the regulations themselves. They are assessing for has the regulation itself been met? So right through from Part A through to Part S and then T ultimately. They are not coming in to do a check of the quality of the homework, as it were.
Yeah.
That's the duty holder's job.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's up to the duty holder to satisfy itself, and for the design teams and contractors, consultants supporting design teams to satisfy themselves. That's why we have a set of competency regulations as well.
Of course.
That's
the 8000 series.
Correct.
Principal designer, principal contractor.
Correct. And obviously a supporting set of secondary competency regulations as well, discussing the importance of skill, knowledge, experience, and behaviour. So I think it's understanding and flushing out in detail what good looks like at a Gateway 2 submission. What good, then that same question, how that applies to Gateway 3 as well. And we're seeing some really good progress in some of those discussions, and the tier ones have to do a lot of the heavy lifting here, because they'll set the standard, and the rest of the industry will follow. And from what I've seen with my work with the CLC and some of the major tier ones across the industry, that is happening, and there is meaningful engagement with both the regulator, but the Department of Levelling Up as well, Department for Business and Trade through the CLC, on getting that specificity nailed down into potentially some industry-based best practice to say, when it comes to developing a fire and emergency file, this is what good looks like. CCP, this is what good looks like, etc., etc. So it'd be really exciting to see how that all starts to take shape, but it is starting.
It is. It's interesting. We talk about the tier ones. We've the definition of a principal contractor. We sort of, there's various. You talk to people and people describe a large main contractor either as a main contractor, principal contractor, tier one. We prefer, I think we're sort of moving towards the term principal contractor because of course that aligns itself to the descriptive term of the 8000 series in relation to the competency of the principal contractor. But of course there's contractors and there's contractors. Some contractors are engineering construction companies in their own right. They design, they engineer, they construct. And there's others which are effectively management companies where everything is subbed down, up, left, right. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how the business models of these different types of ways of effectively being the principal that brings the whole building together and hands it over eventually, how that works. Because of course some will be far more geared towards fulfilling the requirements of Gateway 2 and 3, and others are going to struggle because they may not have the resource or the skills or the knowledge in place internally to do it, and then look to sub it out. But of course, if you sub it out, could start to get expensive. I'm sure there are some individuals that will make a very nice career out of being the person that brings it, being your gateway to Oracle that brings it all together for you, so you can not worry about it and carry on doing what you are, historically do.
I suspect you're right. The operating models of a principal contractor, and to some extent some principal designers as well, who are not wholly discharged of their duties.
No, of course not. No. We could talk about that one all day.
All day, couldn't we? Absolutely. Yeah. and the nuances between how we've come to know what a principal contractor and a principal designer was under CDM and what it is and will be under the Building Safety Act are probably a side conversation to have. However, as I said earlier on, I don't tend to have a discussion about risk without having the same discussion about opportunities that come from that risk. And I would hope for those principal contractors, as you define it to be, which include those major tier 1 organizations that perhaps do have that particular operating model, know, and I suspect they do know, that there is no dereliction of the duty within the regulations. You cannot devolve
just because you've
subbed it out. It still falls to you. It is your duty to do. That is quite unlike. Well, it's not actually. I mean, the conversation I had very recently was a clarification on whether or not that this same thing could be done via that subcontracting model. If you do this thing for us, would that be okay? No, we could do it for you, but if it goes wrong, guess who's explaining why it goes wrong? Because ultimately, it's the duty holder that makes the submission. It's the duty holder filling out a building regulations compliance statement. The supporting information that might sit behind that particular prescribed document, like, for example, declaration of performances for many passive fire safety products that will ultimately not form part of a gateway to submission specifically. But I suspect most duty holders will damn well want to make sure that they know where it is and that it has been appropriately assessed, just in case they need to refer back to it as a result of any information that's been presented within their prescribed documents. And I think the reason I go down that particular rabbit hole is because it's a very, very good example on why some of those more, I might be being a tad unfair, but proactive principal contractor organizations who have moved forward with this and said, whether it's a Part 3 requirement or a Part 4 requirement for our existing stock, which we still have freehold control over, and therefore have maybe some accountable person sitting underneath our operating model, we will still lead the charge. We will set the standard, we will set the tone, we will set the requirements, and as APs or as contractors, if it's a Part 3 conversation, you will work to this standard and you will do these things to support us in meeting our regulatory requirement. So that is going to take some thinking through, my very clear message has always been to those organisations, be perfectly clear that however you are set up internally and however you have done this previously, the duty remains with you. Yeah,
and I think that's, we are moving away from the days where just because you subcontract the provision of goods or services does not mean that you sub out the provision of, the risk or responsibility that sits within it. And coming from a world of being not only a manufacturer of passive fire products but a specialist subcontractor installer, I can empathise with the position of specialist subcontractors or manufacturers. I've got a couple of things actually. You talked about products in terms of how they now have to be listed effectively. And just going back to our document of the pass mark under manufacturers, they have to be registered with the CPI against the Code of Construction Products, have all relevant product sets and systems verified with a current CCPI verification mark. So if a manufacturer, an ASAP member manufacturer wants to choose the pass mark, they have to have the relevant products listed under CCPI.
Brilliant.
So we were talking, it's because like with all of these things, and the beauty of the beauty of the pass mark is because it's an ASAP pass mark, we can effectively put in there as requirements of it third-party stuff that's not ours. Because why would the ASAP go off and rewrite the book on Code of Construction Products information? It's already there. Already exists. It's already set up. So we just make that one of the requirements of a manufacturer or distributor, actually, of products. Because, again, we could have a whole conversation about the distribution of products. So that's something we've added in. So in terms of where the original question was, where you think things have moved from for this year. Where do you think in the last 12 months things haven't moved on, or you've got a frustration with by virtue of its pace of delivery?
I'm reticent in part to give the answer that I'm going to give, because you know me well enough that I will give the answer that I want to give.
That's why you're here.
That I think, but the reason I am reticent is because I'm conscious that it's going to take a long time. And I talked earlier on about generational legislative reform, and we haven't said the C word yet, but I'm about to use it.
Okay. We can bleep that out if you want us to.
It's not that one, hopefully. Culture
yes.
is a word that we should always come back to. You know, we should always come back to how we want people to conduct themselves, how we want what behaviours do we want to see, and having a personal passion in behavioural economics and the science of human behaviour as that relates to my field of expertise in fire engineering. I'm deeply and acutely aware of the observations that we make across the industry, perhaps not moving at the pace we want them to move, given that we are a number of years past the trigger event that's led us to where we are today. And candidly, we could and should have been doing a lot more, a lot quicker, without having to wait for regulations, without having to wait for guidance. Those that have been in the industry for any period of time, but significantly those who have been around for longer than most, will recognise that some, if not most, of the practices that we have been accustomed to were never fit for purpose.
No.
And regulation, as strong as it is often not the silver bullet that we think it is. And we have precedent for that. We have precedent for that, especially in information management and what we now refer to as golden thread, because in the building regulations, we had regulations 38, 39 and 40. Those were information management provisions. Those required the duty holder to hand over information relevant for the owner-occupier of the building to manage it safely. And we just didn't do it. And the reason we carried on not doing it was because it wasn't enforced. In fact, from my own research, I know only of one attempt at bringing a case against non-compliance to Regulation 38, and it was a local authority body in London, and it was deemed not cost efficient to pursue the case because there was no meaningful outcome that could be sought. So I think going back to Dame Judith's messages as well, it's why she was quite clear that the culture piece is as important as it is, and it's about the industry wanting to try and do better. And I think where I've become quite frustrated at times and disappointed is probably the word I would use, is seeing the repeat in the minority of cases of past practices. For a whole host of different reasons, ignorance maybe being one of them, cognitive biases, and so on and so forth.
Is an excuse, though? I mean,
it's certainly not. No,
there's enough. I mean, if you look at what we're doing here, we were talking before the cameras went on about how people digest information these days, and one of the reasons why you and I sit on the red sofa is the very reason that in the last 10 years people digest information very differently. This podcast wouldn't have existed 10 years ago because it actually would have been a PowerPoint presentation presented to some people during lunch, along with some sandwiches from Marks and Spencer's around the corner. We can forego the Marks and Spencer sandwiches, although if you want some, I'll get them for you next time you come. In terms of the CPD, or as somebody, it did make me laugh actually, CPDs to architects by manufacturers. Apparently one particular architect said to me, well, we don't call it continuous professional development, we call it corporate provided dining. Which I thought, you clearly don't bring your lunch to work because there's always a CPD at 12:30. But I don't think not knowing, even in its most basic form, cannot be an excuse now.
It's definitely not. It's definitely not. But people will still present it as an excuse. Some good friends and colleagues will refer to that minority in the industry as the head in the sand brigade, because it is easier to turn a blind eye to these new requirements and hope and pray that the world is not changing as we know it is changing. So I would have liked to have personally seen a lot more proactivity, more broadly across the industry, in terms of embracing some of these new requirements. The antithesis to that, of course, is that there have been some really good examples where some organisations have done exactly that. And we've discussed a couple of those examples already, but there were a good number of principal contractors, developers that, for example, in December 22, when the government announced the consultation, not just on second stairs, but for the removal of the national classes from approved document B, pulled existing planning applications and existing initial notices on the basis that those existing notices in particular had single stair designs in those high risk buildings. And those organisations did that at their own risk, because it was merely a consultation from government at that point. But they did that in recognition that they wanted to, note, and they wanted to recognise the need to provide multiple means of escape for all people that use our buildings, not just those of us that are able to make a decision to get in and out of a building on our own volition, and not be told that we have to sit in a lobby or wait for a lift. So, as I say, that's the antithesis to sort of my personal frustration in where could things have moved a little bit further. But look, we all, and including government, have a part to play in encouraging that. We have to strike the balance between carrot and stick. It can't just be one or the other. And we have to get really noisy about the good practice as well. We've got to champion that. Yeah. And I don't think we do that enough. We've got to sort of point and put people up on those pedestals when they deserve to be, to say, this is what good looks like. So I'd like to see a bit more of that happening across the industry as well.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's that typical sort of British thing that we're embarrassed about celebrating success, whereas if this was the States, there'd be ticker tape cannons and firing stuff into the air and sitting on the back of an open top Cadillac waving at the, we're quite embarrassed about our successes. And some might say, well, it's what you should be doing, so why celebrate what you should be doing? The fact that people haven't been doing it and now they are should be celebrated. You mentioned a couple of things there, and we do occasionally get. I got an email from a I was going to say fan then, but Max will berate me afterwards. I don't have fans. Somebody who watches some of these podcasts, she said sometimes you should ask more edgy questions. I think she's under 25 to say the word edgy questions. Stacey, her name is. Thank you, Stacey, if you're watching this one. And she was talking about a couple of things that are still, some of it's still out there, some of it is, and if you watch, there's certain individuals on LinkedIn that post something and then answer their own post, which I always find quite amusing on certain things. And there's a couple of subjects I suppose we should look at. You mentioned about the and we did the Bristol event last week. And we had a notable person from HSE called Mark. Mark, what was his second name? I can't remember.
That'd be Mark Wilson, manager.
Mark Wilson. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Your brain is clearly somewhat many years younger than mine. Mark Wilson did a presentation, which was very good. I think he was talking about Gateway 1.
Yes. Yeah.
Which was very informative. And because he was health and safety executive, I asked him the question aside, not in the auditorium, about where they were with the commission on the proposed removal of BS 476 from ADB. And at the moment, if I ask anyone from HSE or anyone from DLUC what's going on with the proposed removal, and rightly so, because it's not been concluded. But I get crickets. I think is an American term, as in silence, and it's me being cheeky, sort of probing the bear to see if something comes out. But everyone has a view, and I think that's the important thing. So we don't know what the outcome is going to be. Personally, this is entirely. It's not even the view of the ASFP. I'll be very clear on this, because my world as a manufacturer and a installer was removed from 476 because we were a newer industry, and therefore we were very much 1634 and classifications to 13501 and stuff. So I wasn't really, I'd never really worked predominantly with 476. So when I say I didn't care about it, it's that I didn't use it, so it didn't have as much intrinsic value to me. So I think personally, I think it's going to be a question of when, not if. But that's only my personal view. And to what quantum of when, not if, I don't know. What's your view on it, and why do you think the proposal came about?
So there's some historical context to the last part of that question. Candidly, and I'll declare an interest that I'll walk a very tight line here as the chair of the government's ADB technical review, and I'll talk only as Aman sitting here, and put that other hat down to one side and be very careful about not sort of. These are
your views
line.
alone.
These are my
not
views.
Anybody else's, indeed.
But what I can say, as a matter of fact, is that this is a conversation that has been happening since before Grenfell, in terms of the relevance of the 476 series, with the introduction of their counterpart European norms. Which is probably exactly one of the many reasons why you didn't use them as a practitioner when you went during your career. The conversation, I think, has come about as a function of a wider review of approved document B, but also a planned wider review of all approved documents as well.
Yeah.
And any user of approved document B. And I never ever talk about the approved documents without reminding people that they are guidance and only guidance, and a way of meeting the functional requirements.
But it is I coined this phrase, and I don't know if it's right because I'm not a lawyer, unless I'm in a barrack room, and then I am. You have to be a certain age to understand what I'm talking about. But for me, the code like ADB is what I call retrospective law, as in if you follow it and something goes wrong, you'll be if you've not followed it and created an alternative, the alternative you've done has to be equal or approved to
correct. There's very, very careful wording used in the approved document itself, particularly the words may and could.
Of course, and that's where it goes wrong for me. See, because
100%.
I'm a bit too much of a blunt instrument to be that subtle.
The Secretary of State, has been very clear that the following the approved documents should demonstrate compliance, could demonstrate compliance, provided it's been followed appropriately. And hence why the clarification I always try and make when we discuss these items publicly is that when we refer to any approved document as statutory guidance, the statutory part of it does not necessarily raise its status, prevalence, importance over an equivalent design guide or an alternative approach to design, such as performance-based design.
Well, you have
for example.
you have BS 9999 and 9991, so you could effectively follow that.
Correct, and people do, and there's obviously a lot of cross references to those documents, but of course the polar approach to that, code complying design approaches, is what we fire engineers refer to as performance-based design, and that's using the BS 7974 series to present bases of quantitative and qualitative evidence to demonstrate that same evidence base that's required for that particular functional requirement. So, and indeed, approved document B steers you in that direction for uncommon building situations, amongst others. So, coming back to the 476 and why I wanted to sort of make that clarification, and also remind the audiences in particular that if you follow any approved document, you will see a multitude of normative references to existing British standards, European norms, and ISOs, and that's always been the case.
Absolutely, because it's like they're basically like sedimentary rock, aren't
correct.
They? Nothing. Very, very rarely is it like it's you don't get this huge explosion and then there it is. 1634 references 476 on pages 2 and 3 multiple times.
It's a recognition that there's no value in duplicating information. If it's done well somewhere else, then
reference
referenced exactly that. So the the nuances of the conversation around 476, as I say, predates why we're here having this conversation, and obviously, the 14th of June 2017 being the primary trigger event. But the context coming into the why that was pitched at that time in December 22 as part of that 3-subject consultation. Of course, it was 3 subjects that were the 3 areas where industry was being asked to respond. Was more, I would suggest, a matter of opportunity to try and get something done meaningful in that space where we knew we wanted to take that particular approved document, because it was a fundamental recommendation falling out from phase 1 of the inquiry. There was some confusion around the testing regime, what was appropriate, what wasn't appropriate, what definitions for classes were right, were wrong, etc. And that's certainly not a rabbit hole I think we want to go down for this conversation, but it's right to bring that clarity to a guidance document that is heavily used and widely adopted. And I think, again, speaking as myself and only myself, what may have been overlooked at that time was the potential impact of just a blanket removal of all of the 476 series, and where those gap analyses might, or the gaps, if you like, in the guidance may or may not have existed. So it became very clear very quickly that it was not a simple case of Control-Alt-Delete on the entirety of that library.
And I think, we talk about this, it's very easy to sort of, it trips off the tongue, removal of 476 from ADB, but of course the ramifications are far reaching. And our responsibility is, as a body that represents the passive industry, is to, whatever the outcome is to support that transition.
Yeah.
And I know one of the biggest effective areas will be let's call it the traditional internal timber fire door industry, because they still predominantly work on 476.
Yes,
and that's
correct.
That's for a lot of reasons, as in, they test a door set, but the certificate for that door set may not represent it then transferring into a door assembly being installed in a new build, for instance, because the frame may have been installed by the local carpenter, the joiner. The door leaf is as per the test. The hardware may have been swapped out, equal or approved, and of course the supply chain. A lot of the materials for internal fire doors comes from the supply chain of builders merchants. And of course, selling on through a builder's merchants is infinitely harder to do it through classification of a door.
Yes.
They'll be selling completed door frames with the door inserted in it, with the hardware and the glazing all in. They'll be selling a complete system, which they would then put into the hole in the wall, and then obviously having to fix it as per the tested sample in terms of centres and depths. Well, that's fine in some respects in the sense of new build, because you just deliver a pallet full of door sets and put them into the holes that you've created in the openings. But actually, and I don't know what the numbers are, so I'm only saying this from the point of view of there is a percentage of work, which of course is change of use, refurb, service and maintenance, that you can't rip out the whole frame and fit a new door set, because all of a sudden everything has to be a system that has got a classification report sitting against it, and you then fit it in. So it's going to create a whole series of different challenges.
And I think that's the wider impact assessment that was, as at that point, unquantified in terms of the unintended consequences on the industry more broadly.
Or the law of unintended consequences, correct, which most people don't.
Yes,
there's Murphy's law. Can it go wrong? Will it go wrong?
Absolutely.
And the law of unintended consequences will do this. Oh, I didn't realise it would have that net effect on my decision. Yeah.
So, I mean, to finish the answer off as well, and the reason that the industry probably, whilst it is waiting for some additional information on that particular topic, will probably continue waiting for a little while longer on that one, is because the focus has been on the other part of that consultation, which I dare say we'll come on to. But there was a clear priority that the department wanted to take forward to give additional clarity to the industry, or at least attempt to give additional clarity to the industry, which probably took the focus away from those two other subjects that that same consultation had raised. But we're in a position very shortly to learn a bit more about that.
Can I ask something to be considered? And this is me asking you, because I said before about we're here to support the transition. Now we know that some of the laboratories are increasing capacity, so we know that there's new furnaces being opened up in some of the labs, and that's great because there's been a capacity issue ever since 2017. But it's quite a seismic thing to take out something, a standard that has been traditionally followed by certain sectors. Not all, because some of our members have moved away from that, and that now are, they have full classification reports on the systems that they manufacture. But whatever it's not necessarily, like I say, I personally think it's a question of when, not if. But for me, the challenge will be in the transition. And the transition can't be a year, because it can take you 6 months to book a test. It can take you 4 months to get your test report. Yeah. It can take you another 4 months to get your test report put into a classification report. You're already past a year. And if certain sectors of the passive fire industry are going to inundate the labs and the cert bodies, it's not necessarily that it's not the capacity. Although if all the organisations who I think would then get on the phone and start booking tests that will create a problem. It's actually a number of qualified people that can write up the reports.
Agreed.
After you've done the test.
Yeah.
And if you remember the Stella Artois advert where the farmers were the celebrities driving around in the Lamborghinis, these guys and girls probably will be the fire test equivalent of the Stella Artois advert.
I think it's something that flies under the radar to those that even in the fire industry don't quite realise what that capacity issue has looked like since, as you rightly say, from 2017 onwards in the fire testing sector specifically. And it's great to see that is starting to unlock. Yes. But it is only starting to unlock, and we've seen suppliers, manufacturers have to go overseas to the Middle East to test their products and then bring them back in. And
they do that just because they want to go to Dubai for a fortnight.
Say there's probably a couple of other benefits in it as well. Yeah,
that's why. They do that.
But we know again that that's not an overnight solution. No. We know that those additional furnaces being commissioned and installed and set up you can have the facility there, but the personnel is not coming in behind it. Much the same in design fire engineering as well. Yeah. Speak to any of my colleagues in the fire engineering sector and they will tell you there is a human resource capacity issue. We just don't have enough hands on deck, as it were. Yeah. And this was something we quantified actually in a piece of market research very recently. It's not been published yet, but perhaps that's something we ought to do. And we now being Totus Digital, and we put some numbers on it, some quant on it to set out exactly what the scale of that capacity issue looked like. So I think all of these are items that why you really have to look at these things strategically and holistically. Yeah. As you say, it's not as easy a task as to go, we're going to do this thing and we're going to remove all these things and references from a document, because that has a number of consequences, as we've said, but also a number of unintended consequences as well. Yeah. That if you don't take the time to properly think through, hear from organisations like the ASFP. And
we work in two areas. We work in products and we work in systems. Mm-hmm. And a system is a complete thing. Yes. So it's a fire door set, fire curtain set, fire damper set. It's a product. It's made up, but it's those components that bring that product together have all been tested individually and collectively. And then we represent products, and those products are brought together to give a solution which haven't. Mm. So this could be multiple penetrations through a fire-rated wall where you're using collars, fire bat, mastic, and that particular configuration of separation of penetrations, type specification of penetrations within a 500 by 500 or 600 by 600 letterbox using a combination of different products has never been done before, never tested. And that's the problem with that sector, of the combination of products as opposed to a system, because the systems have been tested, but that particular configuration and combination of products haven't.
Yes.
and that's
Yes.
one of the biggest dichotomies, and that's where you get back to this issue of some of the legacy stuff that's hanging around at the moment, where things were done and there wasn't a ticket sitting against that particular specification configuration of combination of products to support that particular requirement of situation of something
Absolutely.
like a penetrations through a wall. And that's our biggest challenge. Systems are actually easier. And if you create systems, it going back to not standardization, but creating commonality, it's easier to manage.
Correct. And look, I couldn't agree more. But I think that also could potentially bring us full loop back to the importance of information management more specifically, because it's understanding what you are actually assessing. The fire testing element of it is a small part of a bigger piece to satisfy you as an installer or as a duty holder that we have a compliant system solution there. And we've seen a number of ways that the high hazard sector mitigates that. APRs, approved product registers. You can only use this with this, that with that, etc., etc. We don't have that same stringent regulatory control in residential. It's coming and it's starting to happen now with the regulations that we've been discussing. But I absolutely agree with the concept, with the principle of recognizing at a philosophical level, the output of a fire test is a demonstration of conformity or compliance to a regime, a specific procedure that has been followed through appropriately, and an output was measured as compliant at that point in time. It's a part of the compliant solution, but there comes after a whole host of variables that could affect that quite significantly at the most important part, which is maybe 10, 15, 30, 40 years after installation, when you actually need it to do the thing that it's there to do.
Absolutely. Yes. Because it's all sleeper. They're all sleepers, aren't they?
Yes.
They sit there waiting for something to happen. So one of the other subject matters that pops up, and there's a couple actually, and just we were talking about something then, it just reminded me of another that's probably worth a conversation. But one of the other conversations we have, and we asked, I believe we have a mutual friend in Mr. Ben Bradford, who is worth his weight in gold in podcast terms. He'll get loads of.
He'll be pleased to hear.
He'll get loads of associations. He'll need an agent by the time they've all finished chasing him to come and do podcasts for them. Is the conversation around this two staircase thing? Now, I get asked this quite often, and to understand the ASFP, we represent manufacturers of products, installers of products, designing in passive, testing it, certifying it. And we do have members that are effectively engineers or risk assessors and stuff, and that's actually growing. However, I've been asked my opinion on it, and not because I didn't want to answer the question, but more to do with the fact that it's not our field of expertise. My answer's always been, it's not necessarily the number of staircases. If you want to design in 1, 2 or 3 staircases, and of course it's all design dependent, I can't answer that, whether I think it's right or wrong. What I can tell you is ASFP and its members will make damn sure that route is a protected primary or secondary means of escape. So people can leave the occupied space safely because our members have made sure that shaft is protected. Beyond that, I don't necessarily have an opinion, but you may well have an opinion based in where you are. And what would that be?
I do have an opinion, and again, notwithstanding
the foregoing,
yes, that I've already clarified.
You're on.
Look, as a engineer, as someone who has taken part in multiple design conversations, design teams, I think it's very, very important that we think scientifically, but also very critically about the solutions that we are providing, either from a passive or active provision to deliver fire safety in buildings. If we go back to the various, and speaking as an individual, frankly confusing announcements from DLUC around what they intended to do around second stairs, I don't think it was helpful to suggest that those living in single stair conditions today were any less safe, at the same time as announcing that additional safety provisions were going to be introduced by virtue of a second stair coming into buildings over, at that time it was 30 metres, then of course lowered in a further announcement after engagement with the industry of some description by the Secretary of State to 18 metres. So I've had multiple conversations with residents of higher risk buildings where they've asked me my opinion and clarification on that. So does that mean I'm better off in a 2-stair building of, if my building was built today with a second stair, would that make me safer? Because that, if I read this thing from the department, it's telling me that might not be the case. So I don't think that's overly helpful. I absolutely support the provision to include an additional mean of escape. I absolutely do support it. I support it on the basis that it is a function of scientific evidence-based policy making.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are we trying to do? What are the outcomes here? The same questions I ask my fire engineers to ask on their multiple projects. What are we trying to achieve here? Life safety, property safety, is it firefighter safety perhaps, and work back from those primary objectives. And the same principle can be applied to this second stair conversation. If you look across the international regime, there's been multiple different approaches to this. Some have gone with second stairs, some go with a slightly nuanced version of that. Some have gone back from having recommendations for second stairs into just single stair conditions. However, as I say, I do think we are in that space where we need to lead from the front on this one and make this work. So the ADB working group was busy for most of last year helping the government to make it work. And very shortly there'll be an amendment to ADB that I don't think personally I would stand behind and support. And candidly, the reason for that is I don't see any scientific basis to the recommendations being made. I don't see any equity of egress for occupants that require level access.
Yeah.
And I see no improvements on the safety of those men and women that go into the buildings when we are all trying to get out of those buildings, which I think is an inherent disappointment. It's also a slightly different precedent that we're setting here in terms of an amendment to a piece of statutory guidance that might not have the evidence base that other amendments have had previously as well. Throughout, I'll give multiple examples, but throughout the development of guidance throughout the years, whether it be CP3, the original stay put document released, of course. Also, it could be, I suspect, I might be being a bit unfair, but most fire risk assessors don't, if you were to ask them, why is 18 meters the distance that you apply for a single direction of travel in your fire risk assessments, and then why is it 45 meters? They might not give you an answer other than, well, this guidance document tells me that. And if you dug deeper behind that, you would find an implicit scientific reason that goes way back into 1910s and the famous Edinburgh fire with the national anthem, etc., etc., and the post-war building studies and so on and so forth. There is a scientific research that you can point to derive that recommendation as it exists today. And I think any future amendment to any approved document needs to have evidence-based scientific origins to it and not be a function of political will.
Yeah, which could be more driven by emotion than scientific evidence. Yeah. No, and I think it's good. And of course, you mentioned stay put policy. If you've got a stay put policy, then does it matter how many staircases you've got? Because everyone's effectively being told to stay put. Because we know Grenfell had a stay put policy. If they didn't have a stay put policy, would have everyone left?
Well, this is a really interesting discussion, and I think it's one that we've been having since June 2017, quite frankly. And of course, we've had additional guidance in this space to allow fire and rescue services, for example, to override the stay put strategy.
Yeah.
And it is a design strategy as opposed to an evacuation policy, because of course the antithesis of an evacuation is to do exactly that, stay put.
Yes.
but it's quite right that we are continuing to embed those principles, as I say, those origins being from CP3, to allow people to be to remain in their dwellings safely. However, we are in a slightly different world now, where to use the wrong term here, but the zeitgeist of how we as residents in higher risk buildings, I think, has changed ever so slightly. Residents communicate a great deal more than they used to.
Yeah.
They have infrastructure that allows them to do that near enough instantly, WhatsApp groups and so on and so forth. And it's awfully hard to hide big red trucks with blue flashing lights announcing there might be something wrong in the building. If I lived in a block of flats and I suspected that there was an incident in a building, you better believe I'd be getting out of that building with my 2 young children and my wife.
I was going to say, no bit of paper on a notice board in a lobby that says stay put.
But that's also my right to do that. It's my right to choose to do that. And it's also the right of anyone requiring level access into and out of buildings to choose to do that as well, irrespective of whether or not the Fire and Rescue Service have told you to do something or not. And the converse is true as well. If someone feels safe, or feels like they don't want to potentially enter into a risk area of some description, then they should feel safe enough to do so, and stay put. Now, the design is changing. The way that we are designing buildings is changing to account for that, and this is manifesting itself quite significantly with how we are approaching evacuation lift design and management. In particular in non-managed residential buildings, because the normal fire engineering approach to the use of lifts with the resident in mind first. And this is all about those real end users, as I said at the beginning of our conversation. It's not right and it's not appropriate to suggest that you and I have the privilege of getting out of a high risk building, or even a medium rise building, if we know that there is an incident in that building, but someone who hasn't got the ability to use a stair in particular, it doesn't matter if there's 1, 2, 3, you can have a building just full of stairs and one apartment. If that individual or individuals can't use those things, they need to be able to still get out. And that is without someone assisting them, because in an unmanaged residential setting, there will be no one assisting them. And it is not, as the Home Office tried to suggest not too long ago, a neighbour or someone that is, that may or may not be there to assist that individual. So if we look at London Plan, there's very good wording within some of the London Plan policies that that discuss dignified egress, safe, suitable evacuation procedures, etc., and that's what we're talking around here. So this is about a fundamental shift in how we are applying existing guidance to do effectively what's right. And the bit that I'll and what I mean by what's right for residents, all residents, and the bit that I'll sort of close off that particular topic with, I think, is that it's a recognition and I think a message to fellow fire engineers, but also architects and designers more broadly, when they come to think about these conversations on their projects existing and future. The recommendations that we make in British standards, and I'm very fortunate to chair 2 technical committees there, only comes from industry innovation in the first instance. This isn't, British standards are not drafted by familiar faces and the great and the good sitting in a dark room going, this is what the industry should do. The starting point is always what is happening in the industry.
And I absolutely agree with that.
And unless we think proactively, functionally, and with an innovative mindset, we won't make any meaningful progress in this space. So, but that's starting to shift, and I'm hoping that we'll see some solutions coming forward very soon. No,
I've got 2 takes from that. I think one is, and I'm from a small town called Birmingham. And of course, Birmingham had lots of high rises. And of course, back in the 60s, when they were demolishing all the back-to-backs and the slums, which were communities within themselves, albeit, not necessarily considered to be desirable in the modern 1960s. The alternative that they did was to isolate those communities by sticking them in tower blocks. Because you were talking about how these residents in these tower blocks don't talk. part of that is because actually they are in an environment which limits that ability to communicate. If they're all living in Victorian terraced houses in a street with cobbles on the street, they would all be. I hate to hark back to the good old days, but everyone's front door would be open and you'd go in and everyone would communicate. And part of the design issue of high-rise living is actually people are more isolated than if they were living in those more traditional, street by street communities. So that's a risk in itself. So it's an interesting point, and you're right about people that don't have the ability to use the stairs, because how do you get out? And whether you've got a stay-put policy or not, like you say, whether you've got 1, 2, or 3 staircases.
And I think this comes back to the initial question on second stairs and the positions that people will take on second stairs, because unless that second stair comes with appropriate provisions to deliver for equity of egress for all,
or you have a lift that can do the same.
Correct.
So effectively a firefight. And I was talking to the engineer that did the fire strategy on the Shard. And of course, if you go up into the viewing platform of the Shard, there's no stairs. You have to use the lift.
Yes, correct.
Now, those lifts form part of the evacuation procedure. You have to go in a lift to get out of that building in a fire situation.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, those things have been heavily engineered to be operable within a fire situation that's local to them.
Yeah. And I think that's where we've got to start thinking a bit more proactively in residential. Bluntly, it has to happen.
It means it costs more to build the building, but if that's the case, that's the case.
But equally,
no, I'm not saying that's a negative. What I'm saying is the contract, the client and the contractor, and if it costs more, it costs more.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think it also, I think the final point on that really to make is the closer we stay in our safe spaces of design guidance, and my particular document says this, which means my lift must do this or not do this in this, maybe in this case, we stop thinking functionally about what is appropriate for that particular scenario, and that's where innovation will be stymied. Yeah. So we've got to sometimes, I think, whilst it's important to follow the consensus, whilst it's very important to follow what good looks like, and we started this conversation with a discussion about guidance and the importance of it, it is as equally important to sometimes lift our heads out of books like that and say, is that still right? We've got to keep challenging ourselves on this. We've got to keep asking ourselves these questions. And way back when, in the aftermath of June 2017, when a minister asked us as BRAC, how long should the building safety programme run for, the very, very vocal and unified response was continuously. It should never be shut.
Continuous improvement.
You have to constantly be addressing and challenging the norms here.
At the beginning, you were talking about your interest in human. I don't want to get the terminology right.
Behavioural economics and human behaviour. Yeah,
human behaviour, because it's interesting. Because the thing that we see a lot of, and we know that morality has been commercialised. For all the wrong reasons. But of course, being moral, or the morality of something is subjective. And you hear the phrase "do no harm." So you'll have somebody, and there's various things you could sign up to on Tinterweb, and you give somebody 250 quid, and they give you a piece of paper that says you're moral. Yeah. And of course, as I say, morality is subjective. So your level of morality may be somewhat different to mine, and ours be different to somebody else's. But without anything behind it, you can have an organisation or an individual say, well, I've signed up to this moral charter, and therefore you should do business with me because I promise to do no harm. Which I'm sure there's many an American serial killer that would probably have said the same thing before they go off and do something that they clearly have an interest in. And I'm just trying. We're trying to sort of everything we work on, and you touched on it before. Decisions based on scientific evidence, fact. We tend to work on a similar line, that it's got to have a level of measurability. So it's got to come from somewhere that it can be measured, it can be evidenced. It all relates to how we work, third-party certification. I read out the list of things you have to do as an installer to meet the pass mark. It's all evidence-based competency, third-party certification. Now, one could say that I could have 100 bullet points under what a contractor has to do to achieve the pass mark, and still it wouldn't be enough because their moral compass is slightly askew. Mm-hmm. But taking into account your interest in your expertise, which I know is very broad and way beyond mine, being a comprehensively educated lad from North Birmingham. That's me, not you, by the way. And where do you think that sits? How do you think we stop the emotional element of where we are as an industry being hijacked on the basis that people are selling off the back of some sort of moral position?
That's a very, very good question. I think we often have tangential conversations around this in the subject of competence. The challenge of quantifying behavioural change, and ultimately how to quantify that cultural change that we're looking for as well. Because I see the subject of whether it is culture, whether it's behaviour, whether it's morals, being demonstrable outputs of actions rather than commitments themselves. Because you're quite right, we can sit here and say all the things that we know that we might, if we were so minded to, need to say in the appropriate situation. But I'm sure most, and I hope all in the industry, want to be judged by their outcomes and their performances and what they have done, rather than what they've said. The attempt, and we've seen it. We've seen it across the industry, but the attempt to commercialize, that challenge in some description, however it may look, I fear has a shelf life to it. And this comes, hand in glove to sometimes even things like organizational accreditations. We are this, so we are that. We're 9001, we're 45,001. The quality management systems, etc., etc., which serve a purpose at a point in time until such time where it needs to serve a purpose again. And usually that is when I need to get accredited. But what's happened in the middle of that period? If at any point you were asked about the things that you said you would do in a policy at one end of that journey, how did you quantify, track, and measure that compliance, if you want to call that, up until the next time you were asked to demonstrate it, essentially? And I think being able to answer those questions in the context of how we're, or in the context of what we're discussing, is incredibly important, because it transcends regulation.
Yes.
And it transcends guidance. It really becomes about actual action-driven outcomes that one can point to say, we did do this because of these reasons, or we didn't do that because of these things that weren't acceptable to us. As a practice, we do it all the time. We'll step away from projects very loudly and purposefully if we feel that there's a slight moral sort of conflict, quite frankly, there. And that's our response. That's our that won't change. But I think what we haven't been as good at doing, and again, the last point to make on it really, is looking over the fence to see, are we trying to reinvent the wheel with questions like this? Where have other industries had similar problems to this, and what were their responses? And there's a fantastic book I could recommend to anyone who's watching, and it's The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg.
Okay.
If you've got even a half interest in human behavior and the previous historical examples that the global industry has responded to address these sorts of issues, we've got this massive thing going wrong. What's been the response, and how did we change that massive thing going wrong into a massive win out the end of it? And you will see multiple examples of where people have actually got it right. And there's a fantastic example within a conglomerate of an American organization called Alcoa. the aluminum company of America. If you were over
American,
the seas,
if you say aluminum,
yeah. But the aluminium company of America, and I won't ruin the story itself, but it's an incredible example of how you can turn a major disaster into a huge success story using science, and that's the best bit about it. There is science behind what was done, why it was done the way it was done, and beautifully the simplicity of what was done by a minority within that organization that employed over 13,000 people, I think it was at its height, and transformed not just that business but the wider sector and the wider industry, a high hazard industry as well, no doubt. So we've got to get more sort of global in our sort of thinking on how do we exert, or how do we pull from those examples, exert those examples onto our problem statement here, to start encouraging those behaviors, such that they're almost unconscious biases rather than conscious streams of thought. But we want people just to be automatically rejecting those past practices of old, and that I don't think takes accreditations or registrations to something or someone and so forth.
No,
all of that can be helpful, but it's got to be a bit more. It's got to be far more implicit than that.
It's culture change,
100%.
It's culture change, and I'm sure younger people coming into our industry, in terms of construction industries, their behaviours are probably very different to people who have started 20 years ago.
Yes,
and you can include all sorts of stuff in that. We've seen some of the issues that have been the various services have been in sort of entrenched in recently in terms of historic behaviours. It is about culture change, I think, more than anything.
And we've got a long way to go with it. Let's be absolutely clear about that. But it's all the more important, why it's right to make sure that we're in perpetuity with this.
It's a great word, though.
It's great,
I think that'll be word of the day. What we'll also do is we'll try and put the link to the book. We'll get the details
absolutely
from you, because we do.
I don't think I get royalties, but I think
no. But there's nothing we like more here at the ASFP podcast room than a bit of book peddling.
Yes,
because there's many a notable person come in peddling their Christmas stocking fillers for various reasons. So you have to join that notable club. So it's been brilliant to see you. Thanks for your ongoing support.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being what we call in the podcast trade as an eloquent, intelligent person. So we appreciate you for that. So without saying any more, because I could sit here all day, actually, I'll be honest with you. Aman Sharma, thank you very much for coming in.
You're very welcome.
It's been a pleasure to see you. We have an open door policy here to invite you back and to come and talk to us more. I know a lot of people will be wanting to sort of follow this because, of course, they'll be following it for their own professional reasons. And one of the beauties of this, of course, is that we try and keep people ahead of the curve, or at least in line with the curve, so that they can modify their businesses to accommodate what you and I probably, who are maybe a little bit more informed by virtue of where we sit, we know what's coming. So thank you very much for that, and thanks for your time, and thank you for all the good stuff that you keep doing for our industry.
Thank you for having me.
No problem at all. You're very welcome.